first time I actually been able to get my laptop set up in seconds. It's all good to go, so I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, so it's plug.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Set up for you. Got you the screen, give it everything. Size it in.
Yeah, it's all working great.
Set them up at an angle.
That all looks great.
Test sound works.
Yeah, the microphone works great.
Your microphone check already?
Yeah.
Check, check, check. Cool.
Is this a good place to film?
Sure. Oh, and I'll be standing over there, so there shouldn't be any need for a...
There's no need for the tables or the lob.
It's all should all good.
Okay. Awesome.
You can sit here and do an Instagram documentary at your entire hour.
As long as you're wearing pants.
I like
And yes, that is a challenge.
As long as you're wearing pants.
That wasn't part of the plan.
It wasn't part of the plan.
My nemesis.
You can be in the middle. Oh, I can choose. You can totally be in the middle.
Training center.
You can. That's why I have such white pale skin.
Yeah.
I'm gonna sit here and eat my tidbits. Yay! You know,
It's a plan.
would you like one?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
I have that
So what?
on your house.
Oh, yeah,
I have a clock that looks like that.
Oh, yeah? Is it from the collector's edition?
Wait, you didn't bring the pimp boy? I told you.
It was too expensive. I couldn't break it out of Fort Knox. Mr. House is really possessive about that thing.
Every time they take Adam's arm license, it gets broken slightly more. And it's usually Stefan Roski. Like a full-size bad
I thought you meant a real person's arm, and I was getting freaked out.
Yeah. Every time we take Adam Jensen places, they just break his arm.
Well, you wouldn't be taking Adam Jensen anywhere.
I didn't ask for this.
He never asked for that again. Why does everyone
Not
focus
the
on that
window.
line?
Don't throw me through the... Oh, God.
Again.
Cyborgs.
Do you have any idea how much it costs to replace this window? Hilarious. Do you have any other voices?
Poor Elias. No, he does.
They made him say that. They made him say I never asked for this at the launch party. Right?
Yeah.
He's like, for the record, I didn't want to do this.
Hey, Adam.
He never asked for it.
And somebody said, are you sure you didn't mean?
Did you just get meta on us?
Adam, do you want another drink? I didn't ask for this. But I'll take it.
Hey, Chris. Bonnie. Yeah. Say hi. They were on today. Good. That's awesome. Thank you again. There's no direct flight. No, I had to go by Atlanta. Well, fine. I didn't fly there because I had to book it.
That's because I was born up.
Thank you. Well, I was delayed there for an hour and a half, so I'm going to say yes.
Doesn't work, though.
Atlanta is too big. I mean, it's like 2 miles.
Hopefully the next day.
I also have no reason to go to Hollander.
I think most of the Israeli fans don't have any reason to leave. They always leave by the 4th inning. I will admit my handbag was delicious. Tom is a huge loser. He's still
Well, we all have our
No.
he's still heartbroken about the season ended.
They play hockey, right?
Yeah. Yep. But only AHL.
I moved from Toronto to Edmonton to Montreal, and I hate hockey.
Are you in the wrong city?
Wow.
Horrible choice of
Are you down here like in a penalty box move where they're like, look, if you admit that again, you're going to be deported to the States for another week.
I skate
Time
like
out.
Bambi, okay? I grew up with cleats, not blades on my feet. So. If I could ice skate, I would be a kickboxing mercenary.
On skates.
How else are you going to decapitate me?
With a sword? Oh, wait. One day.
That is a kickboxing.
You just attacked me with your hand. What happened? What did you open?
I never asked for this. He was on a Canadian talk show. Blue.
Okay.
Basically, he plays a serial rapist on the show.
Well, isn't that just what he plays as Adam Jensen?
But he does
you like one of the movies or not? That gets me all the ladies.
And you need them.
Hey.
Suddenly I'm like 100% more attracted to you.
Great voice work.
Well, she can't attack me anymore.
Well, you know, I do a lot of VO work, so it's one way to my heart. That and proper use of the serial.
Or ice skates.
Right.
Or maybe
Ice
it's
skating
just
is my
with
heart.
ice skates. Yeah. Punctuating with ice skates.
Ice splits. That's because he's a robo-dog.
Well, maybe it's just a habit the brain thinks on it. You could be meditating.
It's
All of it. It's all the CCs is from
now they told me. And it appears that
Boone. Yeah, I like putting Boone in a Centurion outfit. 'Cause I'm a bad person.
I'm going to disgrace you, Boone, and take you all around the wasteland and show you off as my trophy.
He's got nothing else to live
I think I posted on Twitter that like basically what he wore all through my playthrough was the spacesuit from the Centurion helmet. So
Cool.
it was all like red.
That's badass. Oh, I love Fallout.
A sniper in pajamas.
Yeah, the sexy sleepwear.
Oh.
That's always good.
Boone and sexy sleep.
I just like him getting killed and then I realized I was wearing a nightdress. Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's so far back, he's not going to take damage. So
He's only taking dignity damage over time.
Dignity damage, wow.
it's a Fallout. It's a Fallout game. We're all taking dignity damage.
Oh, but we like it. We do.
Yeah. It actually partially kills in the PC console when people don't have the character.
As in like,
What
good,
if
I'll keep
properly-
doing it.
Oh no, don't worry. It died a long time ago. I play MMOs, you know.
It's
so
the wall.
why are you just like a bunny? you're paladin. Why don't you have a shield?
I'm really attracted to you right now, but you're like a cat.
Yeah, but that would be an issue for me.
Yeah, I know. I'm sweating.
Bonus.
Chris doesn't know yet, but tomorrow everyone's coming like a furry.
To your
Fairy
to your
phobia?
panel? Is your panel a furry panel?
Not yet.
It is now.
What kind of role-playing game is this?
It was a special effects makeup artist for 12 years.
Yeah, it's a role-playing game, all right.
While you were all sleeping, I took teeth tests and I made you all prosthetic.
How do you explain the strangest dream I had last night?
Was it
When you were
flavored
rehearsing.
marshmallows again? Or the alginate laced with chloroform.
What the hell did I have for dinner last night?
Did you get all the way through your speech? Through your talk while you were dreaming? Did you get
No,
all
I
the
got
way
about 30 minutes in, and then Tom Cruise busted in, and he was talking about the writing in New Vegas, and for some reason it seemed so natural, I just let him talk. So I'm like, what was your direction, Tom? You know, and like, he was dead on. I'm like, wow, this guy's really good.
Yeah, it's okay.
And then you woke up.
So,
And I'm like, oh.
it hurts, I guess.
Right.
Oh, I don't did my food first.
I went to see the Cult a couple of weeks ago, and they were jumping the seat, and there's like a gallery up top of the seating. Strangers standing downstairs, and we went in and went, quick, grab a seat. And we realized that everybody else going around this concert was grabbing a seat because
Yeah, people stop in the middle of that one.
We basically powered through the entire game in a week, including Honest Hearts. And then I got into Dead Money, and I'm like, you know what? I need a break.
It's a little different.
No, I like it. It's just playing 50 hours in a week. It's a little much. Because I wanted to get ready for this talk, so I could look stupid.
Oh.
Too stupid.
That's okay.
I'm still gonna. I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. It's all going to be the same.
I'll just sit here and do like an idiot.
Oh, from?
I will. You're just adding. Is this your like
It's-
for American?
Yeah. I like this. This is my old. It's your burner. Are you a drug dealer? Yeah. I was stealing Smith in that car.
yes, as you saw on Facebook, I did use bonus because of
Nice.
I'll use bonus.
Like, why doesn't your touchscreen work?
Actually,
It's real fun about evil plans. There you go.
was it your turn? I was watching a movie the other night with Kelpie was in it. I didn't realize it was him.
Handed me a phone from
Because it was
1984.
like 1995. It was like
Jonathan had in 1984.
well, this was the Rich Boy Third with Ian McKellen. I'm like, that guy looks so
Handheld gaming.
but he wasn't filmed.
That's really interesting.
There's a name.
Oh, he's not. No, it's good.
You're married to a name.
Yeah. I've met him. I've met him. That you met him.
There you go.
I think he saw you.
Farscape? Yeah. DRDs?
Yes.
The only thing I'm trying to figure out at this point is if we have a wireless mic for questions. I don't know that we do, but that would be a pain in the ass. Is there a mic one over here? There is actually.
And you can paint it like, like Frankie painted the pretty much like already good. You know what I mean? Like the 1812 DRD that he painted, you can totally do your art.
Is there anybody else?
And I think the audio guy is in the back if you needed.
Okay.
Who is he? Who is he? He should be right there, back there in that back corner. But now I don't see him anymore.
No, that's Armin.
I only snuck in so I could get.
No, behind the laptop.
That's the whole reason I'm here.
You gotta pay a lot of money for that usually.
And here you go.
And they only make one.
I've been very bad. Tell me how very bad I've been.
Not in a memorable way. I don't know. Did you get a text?
I don't know, my phone's off.
I actually remember That's big.
Right?
I think I hit
That's what I'm wondering. Pens or pens? Pens. Oh, right. I was like, I'm never gonna do something with pens. All right. Glad you told me.
Case.
There's no guarantee that Obsidian is coming to Chris's house.
That's right. I was going with gunplay.
I look like a robot.
Yeah.
We all are. Except you.
No, I'm not into it. Oh.
You want to say something important?
Oh, I can't keep up. What is a keener?
Google it. Oh wait, you can't. Your phone is from the 1980s.
Don't worry, I'll just stop like you did.
I'm gonna link you guys. Yeah, we transvestite. It's never.
I draw lopsided stick figures. I don't do art. I can't design a little figure.
So now I know what you do.
I'm going to try it.
You are not, dude. Do not do that.
So is that really a place? We're gonna dance on a bar.
I didn't wear any boots.
Okay, Q&A.
Right on. Thank you very much. Don't worry about it. Just leave it on.
No, exactly. Just leave it on. I'll come by after the meeting.
Okay. Sounds good. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
I'm like, no, I got this.
The best professor I ever had refused to let somebody else in his class. And I used to hand you a handout, and nothing I tested on outside of what's on the paper, because you'll never be able to write down my process that I can for you. And I want you listening to me instead of writing down notes. Or if you would
No, that's a good point, actually. I'm notorious for, in the first session that I ever did, like 7 years ago, which was just, it ended up just being me and one other guy. It was supposed to be a panel of 4 people, but the other two didn't show up. And one of them's Mark Laidlaw, so I didn't hate him too much for it. But, and a dude's cell phone went off in the middle of the thing, and like rather than like shutting it up, he like it rang for like 20 seconds, and then he answered it, and then he started talking on it in the middle, and it was a smaller room than this. It was hilarious.
Did you apologize or?
No, but so I went. I was like, dude, you're in the middle of the session. Turn your phone off. But apparently that got around, and now I'm notorious for like hating other people's cell phones. All right, I'm gonna go. It's about 10:01. Good morning. Wow, that's really hot, isn't it? I thought I was going to have to do this, but apparently I don't. I'm wearing Stella McCartney. We have a mic.
Yeah, I know, but repeat the question.
Yes, you got it. I'll do it. I'll run. I'll be Phil Donahue.
No cell phones.
Yes, right.
And the emails are going to get online email.
Right. Thank you. I will say those things first, so I won't forget them.
5 or 10 minutes.
I think probably 5 is okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Yep. Okay, so to repeat that in case you didn't hear it before I get going, please turn your cell phones off. I was just telling Chris, apparently I'm notorious 7 years ago for in the middle of a session when somebody's cell phone went off and they actually started having a conversation in the middle of the thing, you know. I like harangued the guy from the podium. But I think it's an electronic thing since we're recording stuff and everything. And also, the evaluations are now electronic for the second year in a row, so you will receive an email, assuming your badge got scanned, and it will ask you to fill out an evaluation for the session. Please do that. It's extremely helpful to us because the only way we can make sure that that we keep providing content that people actually get something out of and enjoy is knowing what you think about the stuff that we put in front of you every year. So please do that. Yes, sir. There you go. Raise your hand if you need him to scan your badge. Do I? To repeat the question? Sorry. So the gentleman in the back said he'll scan you now if you didn't do that. He'll do that so that you will receive the email and get the evaluation. So if you haven't had your badge scanned, please raise your hand and he'll come around to you. Looks like everybody's all legal. Awesome. Forgive me, Ginger Man. Welcome to the Game Narrative Summit at GDC Online 2012, right? That's this year. Yes? My name is Tom Abernathy. I'm an advisory board member. I'm also a writer and narrative designer at Microsoft Studios. And on behalf of the rest of the current board, which is Lev Chapelsky, Susan O'Connor, and Richard Dansky, we are ecstatic to see you all here for this, our final GDC Online Game Narrative Summit in Austin. I know. We will be moving to San Francisco next spring. The call for papers is already open, so if you've got any good ideas, by all means, please go ahead and write them up and send them in. I think it goes till sometime near the end of October, at least another week or two. And that's going to be an exciting change with a lot of challenges for us, but we're going to do our best to make sure that this event retains as much of its essential character and personality that some of you have come to love over the last however many years it's been, 8, 9. 10, thank you. Oh, yeah?
It's on the shirts.
Oh, it is really? Okay. This is a special event, and those of us who put it on work really hard to make it that way. You may have noticed in your little guidebooks that every night listed among the parties is the unofficial Game Narrative Summit get-together at the Ginger Man, and that's no joke. That's at least as important as everything that happens on these stages. So we encourage you to come out and hang and meet people and drink and have a great time at the Ginger Man. Usually gets going 9:30. Tonight, actually, Right Club will be at 9:30 at the Ginger Man. For those of you who don't know what Right... Sorry? Oh, is it 8:30? Richard lied to me then. Okay, it's 8:30. It's 8:30. If you don't know what Right Club is, it's a sort of jovial, competitive game writing exercise. Right, the first rule is you don't talk about Right Club. But I'm going to break it. Where people are given prompts, usually humorous in nature of some sort, to do some sort of standard game writing activity in a short amount of time, and it's all for fun, but whoever manages to survive to the end usually gets some stuff, and it's a good time, and it's extremely well lubricated with beer, so we encourage you to come out for that. A couple of other notes that I want to give. The IGDA table is right outside. You may have noticed it. If you haven't, if you're not a member of the IGDA and you want to sign up, by all means do. I think their party is tomorrow night. Is that right? Nobody knows. I'll double check on that. Hopefully I'll know by the end of the session. We also have the game narrative poster sessions going on during lunch, both today and tomorrow. This is a program that we run where students from game design and game narrative programs all over the country do what are essentially book reports on games. And the ones that are really good, we have them put onto posters with art and all sorts of stuff and blow up. And the winners of those, which have been chosen already, get pass and to come out to the Game Narrative Summit. So it's really exciting. There's a lot of fantastic work that goes on, so we encourage you to check that out.
Where is that?
It will be on the expo floor. Good question. Booth 123. Looking for anything else I need to say. Oh, the IGDA Writing SIG meeting is today at 12:45 in this room. So, again, if you're a member of the SIG and you want to come to that, if you're not a member of the SIG and you want to sign up, come to that here. The opening party for the entire GDC Online is tonight at 7 at the Copa Bar and Grill on 217 Congress Avenue. That's in your book. Most of this stuff is in your book. And then, again, the Game Narrative Summit after-hours party at the Ginger Man right around 4th and Lavaca. I think that covers everything that I need to say at the moment. There is no better way that I could think of, truly honestly, than to kick this thing off with the legendary dude sitting to my left. I probably am, but he's one of the founders and the creative director at Obsidian Entertainment down in Orange County, California, and truly one of the great people that I know both professionally and personally. I will give you over to Chris Avellone.
I feel all bad. I'm gonna tear up now. Thank you, Tom. That was very nice. No, never. I would never do that. So usually when I talk about Fallout or doing game design presentations, I rarely have the chance to actually speak to developers and narrative designers specifically. So this presentation is a little bit different than the ones I usually do, because mostly I can get down to sort of the nuts and bolts of how we actually go about developing a narrative at Obsidian. And that's very exciting for me, and I hope by the end of this you'll be excited as well, and we'll just charge out in the hallways screaming and yelling and having a good time. So 4-hour story and 400 simple steps. May not actually be 400 steps. That might be a little bit of hyperbole, a little bit of writer license there. But I'm Chris Avellone. I'm creative director for Obsidian, and that microphone is awfully loud. I graduated from William & Mary in 1994, and I spent most of my college education actually, quote-unquote, wasting time by writing pen and paper adventures for Dungeons & Dragons and Champions and a whole bunch of other pen and paper role-playing games. And then I got a job offer to come out to Interplay Entertainment in California, and I've been enjoying California ever since, and embarrassing myself at various Christmas parties and or the Ginger Man tonight, which I hope you guys will all show up to. And I also get to do very much what I love, which is to design and write for computer games. I've worked on a whole bunch of role-playing games over the years. I was lead designer on Planescape Torment, Knights of the Old Republic 2, Alpha Protocol, and currently Obsidian's working on perhaps the craziest RPG we've ever had the chance to do. And to be honest, when we first got the offer to do this game, we actually thought some other game company was calling us up and trying to play a joke on us, because we're like, you want to do a South Park RPG? Are you serious? But it's been a blast so far, and those design meetings are a lot of fun. I'm also currently working on both Wasteland 2 Within Exile, and Obsidian also recently started a Kickstarter project for Project Eternity, which is sort of our RPG take on the old Infinity Engine titles. And we have 55,000 backers as of today, and we're very, very excited about that. So if you've been supporting us, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Also, concerning the presentation today, I've done a lot of work with the Fallout franchise. I worked on Fallout 2 and more recently Fallout New Vegas. And notably, I was creative director on 3 out of the 4 narrative DLC packs for New Vegas, which was a lot of fun. 2 of the ones I'm going to focus on today are Dead Money, which was the first DLC we released for New Vegas, and also Old World Blues, which is the 3rd one that we released. And it also won DLC of the year when it got released, so we were also very, very happy about that, although I think it was because of all the penis jokes that we put in it. The reviewers seemed to really like those. But ultimately, the process for how we approach these DLCs was pretty much the same way that we approach writing the narratives and doing the design for some of our larger titles. It just becomes a matter of how you cram the entire world and scope of New Vegas into a much smaller piece of real estate. But overall, the pipelines tend to remain the same. The approaches that we use is, even though we were doing the smaller projects, there's still a number of the same steps that we use when actually going through the narrative. And so to start, the very first step is we examine the realities of the situation. We actually try and examine all the pillars that are supporting this project. And by that, I don't mean the fun pillars. I mean the ones that will actually get the game done in a realistic fashion from a resource standpoint. Like, how much money do we have to spend? How much time do we have? Does the Xbox version have to be out by Christmas? All of these realities actually do factor into your story and how much writing and scope that you're actually going to do for the project. After that, our next step is we see about doing due diligence. And with that, this DLC process for New Vegas was the first time we ever had the chance to do DLCs. So we actually went and did a lot of research on the existing DLCs for Fallout 3. Like, we played the hell out of the Pit, Mothership Zeta, all the DLCs that got released for Fallout 3. And then we went to all the reviews and user reviews for these DLCs and tried to see what people responded to the most. Like, what sorts of things did they like? Did they always seem to like new armor sets? Did they like the new weapons the DLC introduced? Did they like the different moral choices that were present in the DLC? All of these things became part of our toolbox for, like, here's the player's expectations and things that they actually want to see in these products. So how do we make that as part of our design pillars for the process? Normally, those might be considered shackles, but they actually ended up being pretty liberating for us. We had a number of constraints right at the outset. One of them was we had the rare opportunity to know that we would actually do 4 of these, and I don't know how many of you have been in game development long enough to realize that your hopes of doing a sequel are pretty much a really big random chance. And there's been plenty of titles I've worked on where I thought we'd be able to work on the next installment, and we can't. But with this process, when Bethesda signed us up for the contract, they're like, you know what? You are absolutely going to be able to do 4 narrative packs. And that actually allowed us a lot of freedom to explore the story and expand the scope and sort of like make little connections in between the DLC. And that was a huge plus for us. Also, the fact that each one was a very self-contained short experience also helped focus the storyline even more. It actually allowed us to have a much smaller cast and actually a much smaller, basically allowed us to get to the theme and the meat of the story of the DLC a lot faster. And this next point might seem really, really specific, but if you are a narrative designer, you know how important this is. They told us that we would not have more than 10,000 lines of spoken dialogue across all 4 DLCs. And if anything will make you constrain your vision more than that, you're like, wow, that's 2,500 lines per story. Okay, I guess the cast is going to get a little bit smaller, and we won't have so many random NPCs running around. But constraints like that do put some serious bookends on your story and your scope, which isn't a bad thing. It's just a reality to keep in mind. And to our credit, we did come in under 10,000 lines, although, God, I really wanted to break it sometimes. I just really wanted to. One constraint we had with the DLCs is that each of them had to be a self-contained adventure, in the sense that we could never guarantee that the player would actually have all 4 of these. So each one of these actually had to exist in isolation from each other and sort of be their own self-contained experience. And things that we'd gotten from the Fallout 3 DLCs, what people wanted 4 different environments, like different approaches to each DLC and a different tone for each one. So we tried to make sure that we incorporated that into the design pillars as well. And the last constraint was we actually didn't know much about the player character, and that was kind of a challenge. Like with most of the role-playing games we do, the player gets to customize so much about their character that we sort of have to sort of imagine this everyman sort of exploring the DLC and the adventure. So, for example, with the DLCs, all we really knew about the character was, hey, you're a courier for the Mojave Express. Matthew Perry comes along, shoots you in the head. And then you spend the rest of the game traveling to Vegas trying to figure out why Matthew Perry has this big grudge against you. But beyond that, we really don't know much about you except that you're this blank slate, which is pretty true to role-playing games. They usually allow you a variety of different ways to sort of like build your character and choose it. And the important thing, as long as you're being given all these character build options, you're having a good time, and we just want to make sure that you have a good experience as a result. And we call that ego stroking. The next reality of the situation is you have to make sure that your team from top to bottom has a very well-defined hierarchy. You want to know who's in charge of the vision of the project, who's going to be calling the shots in terms of story and themes you want to produce. And you want to make sure that's being broken down across all departments too, so each one's represented. At Obsidian, the way we try and break down the hierarchy is at the top of the chain is our systems designers, because they're responsible for the moment-to-moment fun experience, and that's probably the most important job that there is. And then beneath them are the level designers, because they're providing a context for all the systems that are playing out. And then the poor narrative designers come along at the end and attempt to give context and a reason for all of these things. The nice thing that we have at the studio, though, is that usually the way we have the collaboration periods is usually the narrative designers have a lot of fun actually making narrative reasons for a lot of the systems that exist in the game. So, for example, for New Vegas, we had a series of faction and reputation systems, which is a lot of fun for narrative designers to play around with and explore. So usually all those different sub-leads are able to complement each other's specialties to create a better experience. Okay, so once you have the hierarchy all set up, you also want to make sure that within the narrative design team, you've also broken down how the hierarchy works. Because there's different writers, obviously, who have different specialties in terms of what they do. Some are really good at making NPCs, others are really good at writing companions, some are really good about terminal text, info or item descriptions, interface text. You want to make sure you break down the team according to their strengths. And, of course, that usually involves a lot of tasking, a great deal of tasking. And the next unpleasant reality is what we call the dialogue standards document. Once you've got all the narrative designers assigned to your team and they're all ready to go, it's absolutely important that all of them know how to write for your project. And that's basically creating almost a brand new elements of style guide for each game that we do. And I could do an entire presentation on the dialogue standards document, which would probably leave for another GDC down the line. But ultimately, the thing that the dialogue standards document has are things as simple as, hey, do we double space or single space? Like, do you capitalize the word Deathclaw in a conversation? How do you use tone direction in conversation to communicate things to the actors properly? So when they're in the studio, does the actor actually know how to deliver this line, or do you need to give it more context? And does he actually know how to pronounce the word Dala? All of these things may seem like very, very simple details, but the more the entire writing team has that set up front before they actually start doing a lot of work, the more time you're going to save down the line. And this is a minor detail, but those squiggly brackets that you see there, Those are things that we can actually write in our game editors, and they never actually show up on the screen, even though that data is actually present in the editor. So when we do like text exports, for example, people can see the squiggly brackets for tone, direction, and pronunciation, like when we go into the studio for like script exports, but the actual player will never actually see that unless they actually open the editor. So it's actually a really convenient tool for writers. But that's pretty much the elements of style that we have to wrap up with a dialogue standards document. And then from there, things get a little prettier in terms of, oh, now we can actually sit down and write the story and see what kind of experience we want the player to create. And that's the kind of the sexy part of it. So how do we approach the plot? We ask a very, very simple question. We talk to all the designers in the studio, we pitch around ideas, but ultimately it comes down to asking a very, very simple question. If you heard this story premise and it was being introduced to you as a player, why would you give a shit? Like, why would you care about this story if you were experiencing it? That's kind of the attitude we take for a lot of our writing at the studio. For example, like if someone's writing a lore book, it's very, very important to us why that would even matter to the player. Like, does it give the player more XP as a result of reading it? Does it trigger a quest? Does it give it something that helps the actual character's development, or is it just exposition that's lying around? We don't want solely exposition items. We want things that actually further you as a character and actually help your character evolve and grow and matter to you. And we carry that even to things like factions and groups in the environment. If there is a faction being introduced, what does that faction mean to the player? Can they join that faction? Do they get quests from that faction? How does it matter to them and help their character become more powerful and more interesting? So that's the approach we use for the storyline, the DLCs. What we tried to do was like, you know what? If we want to create a pretty personal story that's focused on the player, how do we do that? And what we did was we took a character named Ulysses, and we basically seeded him throughout all the DLCs, included hints of him in various locations, and it became pretty clear that he was hunting down your player for some reason. And it wasn't clear exactly why, but it introduced this mystery that was sending all these ripple effects across all the locations, across all the DLCs. And the important thing about that was when the player realized that all of these events that were occurring across these 4 separate locations all were due to because of something you had done as a player, that puts the entire focus of all those NPCs' actions directly on you, and it matters to you as a player, and that was very, very important to us. So that's how we approach the story structure for the DLCs. From there, each individual DLC, we'd write a pitch document, which we'd send off to Bethesda to make sure that they were cool with the direction that we had. Bethesda's role in it was to check to see what weapons we were doing, the game mechanics. They would also check to make sure there were no lore conflicts, since they actually own the Fallout franchise, and there might be certain aspects of the DLCs they may not want us to explore, which is fine. From there, then we'd also start doing research for each individual DLC. And that might sound a little bit odd, but for our Old World Blues DLC, we had a lot of research that we did across various books, graphic novels, we watched various movies, and we watched a lot of really bad 1950s sci-fi for Old World Blues. And a lot of that research actually ended up sparking a lot of cool character designs that we actually had for the DLC, and it was kind of an homage to those 1950s sci-fi movies. But that did require a lot of brain-numbing research to actually be able to bring it about. From there, with the pitch document and the research, the next stage in our writing process is we actually get all the leads in the same room, and we're like, has everyone had a chance to pitch in on the storyline? Does like the animators have cool things that they want to do for cut scenes or certain monster animations or weapon types? And how does that all fit in with the theme of the DLC? And once all the leads are basically agreed that we can do this, the scope seems reasonable, everyone's had a chance to pitch in, at that point we bring the rest of the team on board and go, we are now going to present what the theme of the DLC is and what we're building from this point on, so you guys understand what the vision is. What we do is we actually gather the entire team and then anybody else in the company who wants to sit in and watch, and we run them through an hour-long presentation about what the storyline, vision, and game mechanics for the product is going to be. And the one I'm going to show you today is the one that we used for Dead Money. What we try and do is when we do these presentations, we actually film them. And then what we do is when new people join the project later on, rather than having to read dozens of design documents or surf the web and try and figure out how it all relates, they can just simply sit down at their desk, watch the video for 1 hour, and they'll have the basics of what we're trying to do with that product just laid out for them. And it's also good to give the publisher as well. When new QA members jump on board, they're able to watch the same video and get a sense for what that DLC is all about, which was pretty helpful. So in this presentation, when we present the DLC factors, we try and make sure we're including all the elements that are inspiring us for the theme from different media sources, whether they're movies, no matter how old those movies might be, or whatever their new incarnations might be, or however unfortunate those new incarnations might be. Any games that we think carry off certain game mechanics or an ambiance feels really well, and again, no matter how old those games are, they're all especially relevant. We also try and make sure that everybody understands what we're trying to do in terms of theme with the DLC, whether it's survival, whether it's greed, whether it's to add a new difficulty level of challenge to the players. We want to make sure the entire team understands that's what we're trying to do with the game mechanics. And again, that translates into the gameplay, the actual feel of the location. One of the things we were trying to do with Dead Money was sort of create a survival horror experience. So what we wanted to do was make sure the player actually felt like they were adventuring through a city of the dead. And then that would translate into the creature designs and how to evoke horror, scary elements as a result of those. And then once the actual concept artists have a chance to chew those elements over, then they can see about creating those adversaries for the environment that sort of reinforce the overall survival horror theme. We also try and walk the team through the entire plot and narrative summary for the adventure. We break it down into acts in terms of how long we expect the player to be in each act. If there's any movies or media sources that we think would be good for them to reference to actually drive home the feel of that act. And we also try and make sure that we're setting up the flow of the levels from start to finish. We want to make sure that everyone knows where the player begins the adventure, where they end the adventure, and how we're seeing each individual part of the game being broken up. And we do that for each of the acts present in the game. And we also lay out what the level toolbox is, not just the dialogue mechanics for how people interact with NPCs they meet, but also all the other tools they have at their disposal to solve quests, to reach objectives, and all the things that they actually have in their arsenal to solve the adventure. We go through the cast. We used to have a problem many years ago where we would do extensive background documents on every single NPC in the game. And while that's valuable for some members of the development team, to be honest, this is a lot of a wall of text to throw at both a concept artist, and it's also even worse when you're trying to go in the studio and you give a voice actor a huge sprawling document like this. They don't have time to go over something like that. So what you want to try and do instead is break it down into really simple bullet points. If there's a certain reference image that you think a concept artist should go off of for how you're imagining this character, feel free to suggest that. If there's any ways that character is talking to the player in the environment, whether through the Pip-Boy or holodiscs, you communicate that all visually, and then you let the artist run with it. And for example, sometimes it's better just to boil down a character into a one-sentence summary. Like if you're like, you know what, Brian, I really need help with this guy. He's sort of like a sociopathic, Brotherhood of Steel, Merlin type character. What can you do with that? And then he'll run with it. And he'll come back with something amazing that makes me really, really happy, and I weep a lot. And then we'll run through all the characters and do the same thing in terms of what visual signatures they have, how they fit in the environment, how they relate to each other. You know, if they have one personality or two personalities or God knows what else. And any other reference art that we think would be valuable for driving home the feel of that character. We make sure that's all introduced in the actual presentation itself so people know where the character is coming from. And we usually end up with a pretty good selection of cast. We try and keep it really small and focused because, again, we don't have a lot of lines to work with. Although I will admit one bit of trickery I did was, because we had a limited number of voice lines, we started doing things like making some of the main characters mute. So they would only speak through like hand gestures and symbols and just like non-spoken text. But we were only able to get away with that for so long. Also, we try and treat the environments as characters as well. We want to make sure everyone understands what the background of the location is, what sort of elements make that area feel the way it does. Is there any prominent figures that existed, in the past, and how are they making themselves felt in the environment as it stands when the player's adventuring through there? And anything we can do with props or an environment art to actually drive home the theme of the adventure. So, for example, in Dead Money, it's very, very important to a lot of the cast members. They're all basically obsessed with greed or reaching a certain objective, but if they would simply learn to let go of those obsessions and technically begin again, then that's a way that they can sort of solve a lot of their personal crises with the player's help. And constant reminders of that are actually present throughout the adventures in like mosaics and art pieces, and even some of the casino chips, for example, that we actually have in the game actually drive home that theme too. One of the things that we also try and do at Obsidian is we try and create what I call emotional vistas. This might be an understatement. Artists are able to create beautiful visual vistas, and it's really technically easy to create like explosive Bruckheimer moments with lots of explosions to sort of like keep the adrenaline flowing. But one thing that we actually ask our narrative designers to do is consider about creating quiet, special moments that leave an impact on the player. And what I mean by that is if any of you have seen the movie Blade Runner, and I certainly hope you have, there is one moment at the end of the movie where Roy Batty sums up the misery of the human condition in just a short, simple speech. And it's one of the most beautiful moments I've ever watched in cinema. And it didn't require like a lot of explosions going off or like a lot of environment art surrounding him. It just required the right voice actor with the right delivery and the right lines to really leave an impact. And there's plenty of moments that do that, plenty of moments that exist like that in cinema, like when Gandalf is explaining to Pippin what happens after death and how that's not the end. Or even when Agent Smith is like tearing into Morpheus and he's explaining exactly why he hates humanity. Like all of those moments are actually pretty easy for narrative designers to do if they give it some forethought and actually plan ahead for those moments actually taking place in the game. So we try to make sure we spell out where those occur and what they are in the adventure. We had a varying narrative crew in the game. I think Honest Hearts and Old World Blues had the largest number of narrative designers. At Obsidian, they often have to pull double duty with systems and level design too. So the actual number there doesn't necessarily represent all the tasks that they had to do. We try and break down the narrative tasks into a few major categories. One is any of the major NPCs that are in the game are usually assigned to a particular person. Then there's the minor NPCs, which are given out. We also have to worry about any sort of holodisk text, any terminal text that take place in the game, the begin slides for each adventure and the end slides. And also the important thing, if your game has a loading screen or loading screen text, we actually have style guides and formats for that as well. And there are actually certain people that are actually very well suited to doing loading screen text. And used in the right way, they can do a lot to help foreshadow events in the world and sort of create a larger sort of lore element to draw on just by reading the loading screen text during that dead space while a level is loading. Things like item descriptions. And again, also anything we can do to help drive home the narrative with actual inventory items is a plus. And if you can actually tie the theme of the adventures to something as simple as currency or coins, which our players are guaranteed to pick up in just about any game that I know of, you've probably succeeded on the narrative front just by attaching it to that item. Our narrative designers also try to pay attention to any sort of visual storytelling elements we can add to the adventure. Because again, when your line count is that limited, you want to look for ways to use graffiti in the environment to actually foreshadow the presence of other characters before you meet them. And sometimes we'll attach a whole set of personalities and backgrounds to each piece of graffiti in the game. We actually design the characters that actually left that graffiti for the player in the environment. Because it's a lot easier to communicate the story without actually having to stop and talk to somebody if you're going through a certain tunnel and you can actually see this graffiti sprawled on the wall. That actually helps communicate and sort of add to the mystery just by leaving visuals in the environment. Also, as part of the visual storytelling elements, we also do diagrams and maps that show how certain characters move through the levels, and if there's any encounters they had, any campsites they set up. All of these things help give the characters a larger sense of context and belonging to the world. And once you have all those divisions broken down, then it's time to actually write the character in the editor. I know a number of studios actually end up having individual writers that actually have scripters and implementers that will actually implement the text into an editor for them. What we try and do is make sure that all the designers in our studio actually know the editor and are comfortable writing in the editor, because that usually creates a whole bunch of limitations they start training themselves to realize as they're writing, in terms of how many letters can you use per line, like how long does that look on screen, how do I set the emotion tone for this, what sort of animations do I want the character to play during this line. All of these things you can do in the editor, and it also allows you to fix those bugs later on once the bug reports start coming in. Also, at some point, we also actually start doing the dialogue exports, usually on a weekly basis, to see what our word count is, and also make sure that we're tracking things properly for localization. If you're doing writing in the industry, chances are you're translating your game across 6 or 7 languages at least, and that doesn't count if they're actually doing voice acting in those languages as well. That's kind of a hard thing to track, and you have to be very, very careful about it. And once all the writing is done, then the narrative lead goes in and does a consistency pass over all the text to make sure that all the slang is being used properly, like, all the ghouls are being referenced properly, all of those things that he can sort of see from a larger perspective that individual designers may have missed while they're focused on their own work. And also, towards the last DLC was kind of our first experiment in bringing in a technical editor to go over all the lines in our project, which ended up being both good and bad, because on that particular DLC, the main character sort of abused the English language in quite creative ways. So the ability to edit that was very, very difficult. But what we found it useful for was she was able to go through and edit all the player character lines for consistency. And because we already had a dialogue standards document for her to work off of, she was able to spot check all the stuff that we were looking for in terms of formatting and fix all that in her technical editing pass. Because you know what? Fixing that grammar does mean a big difference with the right apostrophe. So because it's a voice-acted game, the work does not stop there. What we do next is, once all the characters are written, we start doing table reads, which is a little bit different than the table reads you do for movies or TV. What we do is we ask somebody at the table who has not written that character to read that character out loud. And then what we do is we look to see where that guy stumbles, like when he's not sure of the context for a line, if he's not sure how to pronounce a certain word. That's when we make the edits right then and there to go, you know what, we probably should have added tone direction to that line. Or no one's going to know how to say that word unless we actually give a cue in the line itself. All of these things are important because they're going to save you time when you're recording at the studio, because studio time is incredibly expensive. And the last thing you want is some actor spending 5 minutes debating this line with you to try and get it fixed when you have like 300 more lines that you still have to read and you have no idea how they're going to get done. Bethesda has a process called text lock, which we're actually going to start using from now on. Basically, there's a period of time where all dialogue writing stops towards the end of the project. And what they do is, for about 2 weeks, they go through and double check every instance of every line and how it's used in the game, in terms of, are there any logic flaws with the quest? Like, are there any voice sets missing? Like, does this guy not have, a sneaking bark when he's supposed to for his voice set? Like, is there anything missing that we need to account for? And it requires a lot of testers over a long period of time, especially when you're writing, so many lines for the game. And then once they're done with the text lock process, I actually cheat a little bit and then do a full-on dialogue export, and then I throw that into Microsoft Word, and then I let Microsoft Word look for all the red underlined words or any of the bad grammar instances, and then I go back into the editor and fix all those instances individually. But that's very important that no one else can be working in the editor while you do that. You just want to make sure that everything comes to a halt, and for 24 hours you sit there and try and correct every instance that you can. During this process, also, we were working with a contracting studio, Blindlight, who handled all of our voice work for the DLCs and New Vegas. What we try and do is send them a copy of what's called a voice side that sort of gives all the description for any voice actor auditioning for the part. Now, the nice thing is voice directors actually will read the text that you send them. So in this case, include what sample lines you can, concept art for the character, what age you want them to be, and they'll take that information, and then they'll usually do anywhere from 3 to 12 auditions for a character, send those samples back to the studio, and then the writer, the producer, anyone else who cares about that part of the process will vote on which actor they like the best, and then they'll see about actually arranging the recording session. And the recording session begins. One thing we try and do through recording sessions is because we realize a voice actor may not have time to read all of this, what we try and do is actually bring screenshots of the game to the studio so they can look really quickly to see what their character is, where their character is located, who that character hates, and who that character is afraid of. And simply by showing those 4 images, in less than a minute, you've told the voice actor a great deal of information about the part that he's playing without having to describe it for 5 minutes and him having to guess about what you're talking about. It's much better if you just bring visuals in there to show him and get him grounded and going right from the get-go. So once the studio session is all wrapped up, then becomes the long process of listening to every single line that you got back from the studio. You do that for a few reasons. One is there is a chance the line changed at some point when the actor said it. They may have had a better take on it. They may have switched words around. You want to make sure for the purposes of subtitles, you've actually got the VO matching the subtitle text properly. Also, you want to make sure that all the post-processing for each line works. Like if you have a computer voice, like is that computer sound effect like actually being applied to every single line properly? And also there'll be instances in the studio where you may have gotten 3 or 4 takes of a line from an actor, and they're all really good. You just have to sit down and figure out which one sounds best in the context of the conversation. So that's part of the listening process as well. And if anything has changed significantly in the studio, and hopefully it hasn't, you have to let the rest of the world know for the purposes of localization. Because it's actually being recorded in at least 7 other languages, you have to let them know immediately if any line is changed according to context, and chances are you may not actually have the liberty to change that line, which can create other problems. But so that's about 400 steps that we go through from start to finish. I just wanted to run you guys through that today. And that's kind of the process that we go through at Obsidian, and I love it very, very much. And I wanted to give a shout out to the other narrative designers who made the DLCs possible. Travis did a lot of the great work for Old World Blues, especially the appliances in the home base. Josh is our project director from New Vegas. He worked on Honest Hearts. John Gonzalez was our creative lead for Fallout New Vegas, and he did some great writing for Honest Hearts. Rob Lee, who is currently at ZeniMax, he has a certain skill with emails that I absolutely cannot match. And that was pretty much about it. So if you guys had any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them.
I'm going to play Phil Donahue. I'm going to grab a mic and come around to you. And Chris, if you would repeat the question.
Sure.
To make sure everybody can hear it. All right.
Question was where did the line limitation come from? Did that relate to they wanted to limit the data size of the DLC?
The question was why did they limit why did they actually have that 10,000 line count? I'm going to guess it was for a few reasons. We didn't expressly debate it with them. The voice acting process for New Vegas was very, very exhausting and perhaps one of the largest ones that Bethesda had ever done. I think when they were going the DLC process, they're like, you know what? To tell a good story, you don't need that many lines. So here's 10,000. Here's all we can afford. Chances are a large part of it was due to budget too. Voice recording is very, very expensive, and the more lines you have and the more actors you have, it can eat up a lot of the resources you would otherwise spend just creating actual physical content in the game.
I'm interested in the research you said you did into other DLCs and the reviews that you read and all that sort of thing. And you said one of the main questions that you then asked yourself when you were pitching plots was, why would the player care? I'm just wondering, are there any kind of rules of thumb? Are there any sort of golden things that seem to apply universally to answer that? Is there any one element that you came up with, like, players will always care about this, other than money and killing dudes?
So the question was, what sort of elements did we get from our research that seemed to apply to the DLC and would want to make the player care about purchasing it and playing it? So a few things jumped out to us. One was players always wanted new, bigger, badder weapons. Like, they just wanted cool stuff for their player to equip and beat the crap out of people. So as simple as that sounds, that still is really, really important. Also, people seem to enjoy costumes. Like, in addition to all the different armor sets you'd include in the DLC, people like getting cosmetic costumes they could actually just put on their character and just walk around with their avatars with a cool outfit on. One other thing was you had to make sure that you had a super special weapon and a super special armor type for each of the main archetypes that play Fallout. And what I mean by that is, like, you want to do something for the thief guy, you want to do something for the speech guy, you want to do something for the hardcore combat guy. And the combat guy breaks down to the melee specialist, gunsman. Like, all of those categories have to be accounted for. So that meant for each DLC, we had to make sure we were introducing about 10 weapons, one of which would be super cool. The other one would be all right, but kind of a nifty item to have. But each one would complement each skill that a player had. And then lastly, people seem to really enjoy the narrative dilemmas and interesting narrative twists in the Fallout 3 DLC. So we tried to look for ways to incorporate that into the New Vegas ones as well. And yeah, that was just a few of the things.
Yes. And Jimmy, keep your hands up for a second, okay, so I can find the next person.
I have a question about line counts. When you had the line count limitation, was that inclusive of barks and things like that? And was there a division that you made between dialogue and reactions and things like that? When you go into the studio, was that, like, your 10,000 limitation, was that inclusive of all the barks and things like you had to do for each character?
The question was, did the 10,000 line count include any voice barks or any voice reactions from the NPCs? Yes, they did. And that adds up really fast, because usually everyone would have anywhere from, like, potentially 30 to 50 lines of just reaction text to stuff occurring in the environment. So that did chip away at our line count pretty fast. But again, that wasn't the reason why we kept the cast really small and focused.
Yeah, my question is about, you mentioned that people like certain aspects of the designs and so on. I was curious about how you got that feedback. Was there a formal method, a formal process of checking to see what parts of the design were received favorably, which ones weren't, or was it just kind of more of a holistic review process?
We took...
Can you repeat the question, Chris?
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question was, how did we sort of, systematically approach the things that people were expecting to see in the DLCs, or they respond positively to, if I have that correctly?
Yeah, what people did like and what areas might have needed improvement.
Right. So what sort of thing that people did like versus they didn't. So what we would do is we took 10 reviews off of Metacritic for each Fallout 3 DLC, and we broke down every positive thing a reviewer said and every negative thing that they said. So, for example, we discovered what the time threshold was for what people would pay for a certain dollar value for a DLC. And, like, you know what? Anytime a DLC even approaches the 3-hour range, like, that is almost unanimously considered a negative by everybody. And that makes sense. Like, you don't want to blow like $10 for a 3-hour experience. And then things like, well, you know what? Did they give me a new armor set? Like, did the DLC feel too linear to me? Like, all of those negatives we would add up and then incorporate that into our design pillars for how we'd approach the New Vegas ones.
Hi. I was curious, what's Obsidian's approach to crafting a really compelling story, but also allowing for a lot of, like, character choice to affect it?
The question is, how does Obsidian approach, allowing for character development, at the same time creating a good story experience? Do I have that rough? Yeah. Okay. So what we try and do is assume the player could be anybody, okay, which is rough. So we focus more on the fact that the more interactive you can make the story, that actually makes it more important and more compelling to the player than just about anything we could sort of script or force down their throat. So the important thing is you want to provide a sort of narrative playground for them to play around in. And what I mean by that is you want really strong characters that exist in the environment that aren't necessarily forcing a story on you. They're just interesting to interact with. And they have a range of reactions depending on what you do that actually end up being entertaining because you're actually poking the environment to see what happens. So we try to make sure they have like a compelling backstory. It's really interesting to talk to and interact with if the player wants to. We just try and make sure that the actual backdrop for the story is interesting enough so it makes it feel like the character's more important than the environment. So we focus more on the actual, I guess, the more visual and sort of environmental backdrop as opposed to go from point A to point B, here's a plot point, etc.
One, I think your Pip-Boy screen popped out.
It always does.
Okay. And two, the fact that the IP is owned by Bethesda, could you speak on the issues that arise when you're trying to develop a concept, but given that Fallout is this huge world of a lot of mysteries, everybody wants to know what happened to Seattle, everybody wants to know what happened to their local area, things like that. What comes up when you want to make something and then you have to go back to essentially, the apparent owner, and then they have to tell you, well, we don't want this yet, or you can allude to this then, and things like that.
So the question is, how do we deal with lore conflicts with a publisher when we have a good idea for a pitch, or what we feel is a good idea for a pitch, but the publisher, it doesn't match with their vision for the lore or any expectations for things that they might want to do going ahead. So there were instances like that across the DLCs, but ultimately, while it was disappointing to hear at points like, hey, you can't do that, or you can't use that particular item, or I'm sorry, you can't have power armor in your DLC. All of those things, we usually found some other workaround that actually made the DLC more interesting as a result of not having those elements. So what would seem to be a constraint or an obstacle just made us think in new directions we hadn't considered before, and I think it ended up making basically a better product as a result.
It looks like you have a very interesting, detailed, lengthy process. And compared to the games I've worked on, you take a lot more time on the story and develop it a lot more, put a lot more resources in, and that kind of thing. Can you say roughly what % of the DLC budget you spend in like sort of going through this task list? Because it seems, compared to the games that I have had the, shall I say, honor to work on, you guys put a lot more time into this kind of thing and a lot more resources.
So the question was, how much time do we spend on this on the stage of the process that I outlined here? So all the stuff that you saw in the presentation for like the PowerPoint for Dead Money, that took about 2 weeks to do, and then after that, the actual core writing depends on the length of the character. How much you have to prep for text lock takes about 2 weeks, for example. But ultimately, you want to resolve all the high-level concept stuff within the pre-production period, which for the DLCs was really, really tight. And that came to about 2 weeks. And then the rest of the time for narrative designers actually usually just spent on their actual writing of the characters and making sure the quests are fleshed out properly. And then when you get ready for the studio, we also have to reserve a good amount of time for our narrative designers to actually go to the studio and listen to the performance, because we found that actually saves a great deal of time, because they can provide context for every single line and explain to the voice actor or the voice director if something's confusing, or resolve an issue right then and there if they suddenly realize, hey, wait a minute, we discovered an error in the script, what do we do? Having the writer right there just to correct it is good. But the pre-production stuff is about 2 weeks. Well, considering...
What percentage of the budget?
In terms of the budget, I would probably have to ask a producer to get you actually hard numbers, Jeff, but I will do that.
Over here. My question is kind of your thoughts on the future of DLC and specifically how it's maybe potentially community-driven, almost as expansions on things within the game itself that you might not have thought had been a hit or success that you want to expand upon, but really was a surprise or kind of an afterthought?
I think the question was, is elements from the community that sort of helped inspire the DLC, or where I see the future of DLC going? Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no. It's so one interesting thing about the process was because the mod tools for New Vegas got released, we actually went up to all the mod community forums and looked for the most common mods that people were making. And that actually influenced a lot of the design pillars that we did for Old World Blues. Because the first thing we noticed as we went up to the Nexus, we're like, how many home-based mods are there up here? And there was a shitload. Like, there was like everywhere. It was like, you know what? People really want a home base in New Vegas. It's better than the one that's there. So like, you know what? Why don't we actually incorporate that into one of our DLC designs? Because people seem to naturally gravitate towards that as a result. And being able to do things like that throughout the process, it makes me want to make sure that we release like mod tools for all our games, so we can see what the players come up with and what they're excited about.
You mentioned that you were able to do the slight workaround with getting the characters to speak through hand gestures. I mean, I've found in the past working with some companies that you talk to animation department and they're overloaded because they've got to do 50 different animations for flamethrower deaths or something. So how do you find the best way to get the team to work together across the games, that you're able to find a compromise like that helps everybody?
The question was, how do you get the resources to do workarounds for things like if you do want someone to communicate with hand gestures, that obviously puts a great deal of a burden on the animation department to actually make that happen. To be fair, I probably over-exaggerated that point a bit. When I said hand gestures for that particular character, mostly it was just written text describing what she was doing or nodding or shaking her head. But ultimately, she would only do very simple animations that would communicate the gist of what she was saying, and it was mostly the text that was written out in the dialogue box that would communicate most of the gestures. And people seem to think that worked pretty well. So that was sort of our compromise. Although, from a narrative standpoint, we always did try and talk to the animation department if we wanted certain specific dialogue animations for the characters. Like when we were doing the very last DLC, Lonesome Road, Eddie, the small floating robot, joins you. And we sat down with the animation department. We're like, you know what? We want Eddie to feel more like a Pixar character and have a lot more emotion in how he talks and how he communicates. So one of our animators, Seth, just sat down and made like little sad states for him and happy states and all sorts of things. And we were able to call that for each specific like interaction that you have with him. And he just communicates with beeps normally. So what people would see is they'd talk to him, they'd get the beeping text, but then they'd see how he'd actually animate as a result. And they're like, oh, okay, now all my player responses make sense in that context. So usually there's some compromise you can do that fits within the resource budget.
And there's always mime. I think we have time for one more question. Anybody else? I spent a lot of time over there, so I'll come over here.
In team management, as you're at the top of the hierarchy, how do you apply and communicate these 400 steps with, let's say, code scripters or the animators, the visual designers, audio people? How do you manage a team, a full team, not just with the narrative hierarchy, but the entire breadth of the production crew? How do you translate these 400 steps in between each individual and each section?
So the question is, how do you translate those 400 steps across all departments? So the trick is you don't need to. Usually this is specific to narrative design, and then you choose your battles for what information you want to communicate to other departments. So for example, for that hour-long presentation for Dead Money, like I felt it was important that everybody in all departments know all that information. But that's only a 1-hour discussion that they can refer back to at any time. It was mostly important they understand the vision, the mechanics, and the breakdowns for these characters, level flow, things like that. That's not too hard to communicate with those guys. But ultimately, the tasks that come after that point can usually be broken down by different departments. So for example, the audio department is perhaps the most focused on making sure that all the table reads work correctly, that they're getting all the voice audition sides off to the contractors, that they're actually helping manage things in the studio and actually like helping getting the voice. Whoa, just fucking jumped at me there. The making sure all the post processing works, but like a programmer doesn't necessarily need to know all that information unless there's a programming issue associated with it. So that was kind of a rare. The bleed was rare.
I want to add something real brief to my introduction of Chris earlier. I'll see if I can make him full-on cry this time. Before I ever met Chris, I had the pleasure of working with a couple of designers, Tom French and Scott Warner, who he had sort of brought up in the ways of integrating narrative into gameplay and all that kind of stuff. And working with them was an incredibly pleasurable experience for me, and continues to be, because I still get to work with them both at times because they're both at Microsoft. One of the things that Chris has been particularly notable for is disseminating the philosophy of narrative in game being important and being something that needs to be really thought about seriously in complex ways and integrated into things in complex ways. And I am extremely grateful to him for that, for my own personal life. And I think it's he's a good role model in that way for all of us as we learn more about what we do and we get better about what we do, to try to make other little us's that go out into the world and carry that message and work with people in a cool way. Just a quick reminder, coming up next at 11:30 in this room, some of my homies from 343, Building Transmedia Worlds in a Halo 4, Kevin Grace and Armando Troisi, and in room 11, Choice and Character Lessons from Writing Multiplayer Narrative Games from the wonderful Emily Short. Thanks very much for coming. Remember to do your e-evaluations, and let's have a hand for Chris.
Thank you. No, thanks, Cameron. Shoot. Okay, sounds good. Oh, sure. Oh, no worries. Okay, well, good. I would be happy to answer them, Cameron. It's been a pleasure.
I just tweeted that basically you made me feel like I'm in the right business.
Oh, good. Actually, we got the technical editor idea from you. It's like I was like, I didn't realize there was a special job for that. And I'm like, but I know people I could probably contract briefly and see if it works. And then I felt really bad because the project was not well suited.
No, I was going to say, like, there's a lot. Basically everything you said up there.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I've written slides. I've written the voice slides. The voice slides. I've said it on VO sessions. I've done local pipelines. I've done all that.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that Obsidian. That's why I'm like, okay, if Obsidian is doing that, there's at least one company out there that is validating my choices as an editor. So yeah. So I'll see you tonight.
All right, sounds good, Cameron.
I'm with Games on Other a better shot of you.
Sure, absolutely. Cool. Hey.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk, man.
Oh, thank you.
And I must have missed that.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Zach Fenfrock, made it for like a Nuka break, and he's like, you know what, do you want one? I'm like, yes, I do want one. He put like a personalized name in there and everything, and that's pretty cool.
Were you going to be in GDC?
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I wanted to ask you some questions more about like Obsidian in general.
Sure.
I'll definitely find you later.
And actually, if you miss me, do you want my card in case there'll be a... Okay. Sure. Let's trade.
Thanks very much.
Sure, of course, my pleasure.
I'll see you later.
Hey.
My name's Lawrence.
Hey, Lawrence, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm actually a member of the
I'm actually going to come down.
Yeah. That was crazy. I do. Definitely. So I don't know if you're interested in chatting about that at all. It's my turn to volunteer later today.